Imagine charging into a corporate meeting, completely frazzled with mismatched socks, only to discover that the Uber driver you just bossed around is actually your new CEO. That's exactly what happened to Grace Stone when her dead phone and desperate job search led to the most embarrassing and life-changing mix-up of her life. I was going to skip this story, thinking it was just another fairy tale romance, until I discovered how Grace's authentic personality turned her massive mistake into a viral sensation that transformed both her career and love life. Stay with me to see the exact moment this struggling professional went from nearly getting fired to receiving a diamond ring from one of the country's most eligible bachelors. Have you ever been so desperate for a job that you'd do almost anything to make it on time? For Grace Stone, her entire future hinged on one crucial morning presentation. 3 months of unemployment had worn Grace down to her last nerve. The stack of rejection letters sitting on her kitchen counter served as a daily reminder of her failing career. Each "thank you for your application" email felt more like a personal attack than a professional courtesy. With her bank account hovering dangerously close to double digits, this interview at Stonebridge Corporation wasn't just another opportunity. It was her financial lifeline. Grace's tiny studio apartment told the story of her struggles better than words ever could. The past due notices were carefully arranged in chronological order on her refrigerator, a timeline of her descent into financial chaos. Her landlord had already given her the final warning: pay by the end of the month, or find somewhere else to live. The irony wasn't lost on her that she couldn't afford to stay, yet couldn't afford to leave either. Everything about that fateful morning seemed determined to sabotage her last chance at salvation. The night before, Grace had meticulously laid out her only professional outfit, a navy blue skirt suit that had seen better days, but still managed to look presentable after a careful steaming. She'd set 3 alarms, charged her phone, and even prepared her coffee maker to brew automatically at 6 a.m. But the universe had other plans. The power flickered sometime during the night, resetting her digital alarm clock to a blank, blinking 12:00. Her phone, which should have been her backup, mysteriously died despite being plugged in all night. The charging cable had frayed to the point of uselessness, connecting and disconnecting with the slightest movement. Grace jolted awake at 7:42 a.m., a full hour and 12 minutes later than planned. Her interview was scheduled for 8:30 across town. "No, no, no!" she screamed, leaping from bed with such force that she knocked over the glass of water on her nightstand. The puddle soaked into her carefully laid out resume copies, transforming her crisp credentials into a soggy, illegible mess. In her panic to get ready, Grace dumped scalding coffee down her throat, burning her tongue so badly she could barely speak without wincing. Her hair, which desperately needed washing, refused to cooperate with her frantic brushing. The rain outside had cranked the humidity to maximum, turning her normally manageable waves into what looked like a failed science experiment. Grace's appearance told the whole story of her morning chaos. In her rush to dress, she'd grabbed the first socks she could find, one featuring festive Christmas penguins, a gift from her mother, and the other decorated with colorful Mexican tacos, a souvenir from her last vacation, back when she had disposable income. A critical button on her blouse had popped off as she hastily fastened it, requiring an emergency safety pin that was already working its way loose. Sprinting out the door, Grace discovered the true meaning of Murphy's Law as the skies opened up. Her $5 drugstore umbrella, the only one she could afford after selling her nice one online, immediately inverted in the wind, metal spokes bending like they were made of paper. Rain soaked through her hair and makeup, transforming her carefully applied mascara into dark streaks down her cheeks. Standing at the corner of 5th and Main, Grace desperately tried to revive her phone. She needed the ride-sharing app to get her to the interview, as her ancient Honda had finally surrendered to mechanical failure the previous week. The phone briefly flickered to life, just long enough for her to confirm an Uber ride, before dying again with finality. "Perfect, just perfect," she muttered, wiping rainwater from her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. Grace wasn't just fighting to be on time. She was fighting for survival. Her last unemployment check had already been spent on essentials. Her credit cards were maxed out. She'd even sold her grandmother's antique brooch, the one possession she'd sworn never to part with, just to cover last month's utilities. This interview wasn't just about a career. It was about keeping a roof over her head and food on her table. Making matters worse was the reputation of Stonebridge's new CEO. Office gossip traveled fast in the professional circles Grace still clung to, and Thomas Miller was known as the Terminator for his zero-tolerance policy on tardiness and inefficiency. Former colleagues described him as the human equivalent of a steel trap and about as forgiving as a tax audit. He was precisely the wrong person to disappoint on a first impression. The rain continued its merciless assault as Grace checked her watch for the 5th time in 2 minutes. At this rate, she'd be at least 15 minutes late, potentially a death sentence for her interview chances. She squinted through the downpour, desperately looking for the silver Toyota her app had shown before her phone died. That's when she saw it. A sleek black car pulling up to the curb, looking exactly like the luxury Uber option she couldn't afford, but had splurged on out of desperation. Without hesitating, Grace dashed forward, yanked open the rear door, and collapsed onto the leather seat. "Go! Go! Go!" she urged the driver, not even looking up as she frantically tried to wring water from her hair. "Stonebridge Corporation on West End Avenue, please. I'm already catastrophically late. And I swear, if I don't make this interview, I'll be living in a cardboard box by next week." The car pulled smoothly into traffic as Grace continued her breathless monologue, still not looking at the driver. "I know I look like I just went swimming in my clothes. My alarm didn't go off. My coffee tried to kill me. And this rain is apparently personal. Oh, and check out these socks." She thrust one mismatched foot forward. "Christmas penguins meet Mexican tacos. Fashion statement of the year, right? I should probably just accept that this job isn't meant to be mine. Who would hire someone who can't even match their socks? But I'm literally down to my last $57.42. So, here we are." Grace finally paused to catch her breath, noticing for the first time that the car's interior was suspiciously luxurious for a standard rideshare. The silence from the front seat was deafening. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet the driver's gaze in the rearview mirror. Dark, intense eyes studied her with an unsettling mixture of amusement and curiosity. This was definitely not the middle-aged woman her app had shown in the driver profile. "You're not my Uber driver, are you?" Grace whispered, horror dawning as she noticed the driver's impeccably tailored suit. "No," came the simple reply, the voice deep and measured. "I am not." That single-word answer, "no," came from a man whose life was the polar opposite of Grace's chaotic existence. Behind that measured voice and tailored suit was Thomas Miller, a CEO who had mastered the corporate world but forgotten how to climb toward happiness. What made this notoriously stoic man decide not to immediately eject this soggy stranger from his luxury vehicle? Thomas Miller's world, before Grace Stone crashed into it, was a masterclass in control. His mornings unfolded with Swiss watch precision. Wake at 5 a.m., exercise for exactly 45 minutes, shower for 7 minutes, breakfast while reviewing the financial news. Even his breathing seemed regulated, as if he'd programmed himself to inhale success and exhale anything resembling disorder. The interior of his car mirrored his inner landscape. Immaculate black leather seats, without a single scuff, dashboard gleaming as if it had never been touched by human hands. The temperature was set to a perfect 68 degrees, regardless of the weather outside. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile extension of the fortress Thomas had built around himself. As CEO of Stonebridge Corporation, Thomas had cultivated a reputation that preceded him into every room. Employees straightened papers when they heard his footsteps. Conversations hushed when he passed. His colleagues had developed a lexicon of descriptions that painted a clear picture: emotional glacier, the human spreadsheet, a man who'd fire his own shadow if it showed up late. These weren't just workplace jokes. They were survival guides for navigating his presence. What his employees couldn't see was the profound loneliness that had settled into the corners of Thomas's life. Like many in his position, he belonged to that statistical 61% of CEOs who experience deep isolation despite being surrounded by people clamoring for their attention. Every interaction came with an agenda, every smile concealed a request, every handshake was a transaction. Thomas had exchanged authenticity for achievement, warmth for wealth. His penthouse apartment overlooked the city, but remained largely unlived in, more showcase than home. The art on his walls had been selected by a professional decorator to reflect success and sophistication. Even his meals were delivered according to a nutritional plan designed to optimize cognitive performance rather than satisfy any actual craving for flavor. That morning, as rain pelted his windshield, Thomas sat at a red light, contemplating the day's board meeting. His mind ran through probability scenarios and potential resistance points from stakeholders, calculating responses with algorithmic precision. The presentation on his tablet contained 43 slides of meticulously arranged data visualizations. No emotion, just facts and figures, arranged to lead inevitably to his proposed conclusion. Then, Hurricane Grace blew in, upending his perfectly ordered world. The initial shock of his car door flying open was quickly replaced by something rarer, genuine surprise. Thomas Miller hadn't been genuinely surprised in years. Most events in his life fell within predicted parameters, but nothing could have prepared him for the soaking wet woman with mismatched socks who now occupied his passenger seat, rattling off instructions and life commentary without pausing for breath. His first instinct was to correct her mistake immediately. The words formed in his mind, "I believe you've entered the wrong vehicle." Professional, firm, final. But something stopped him. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps the first spontaneous emotion he'd felt in months. This woman wasn't performing the careful dance everyone did around him. There was no deference, no careful editing of thoughts, no strategic positioning, just raw, unfiltered authenticity pouring out alongside droplets of rainwater from her hair. The contrast between her chaotic presence and his ordered existence was so stark, it was almost refreshing. As she rambled about expensive croissants and job interviews, Thomas found himself studying her with the same intensity he usually reserved for quarterly reports. Her gestures were expansive, her expressions shifting rapidly between panic, frustration, and determination. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen someone express genuine emotion without calculating its impact first. Research has shown that authentic interactions significantly improve well-being for individuals in positions of power. But Thomas had forgotten what authenticity even looked like. His emotional intelligence, that crucial skill that had helped him rise through corporate ranks, had atrophied from disuse, becoming a tool he deployed rather than a way of connecting. When Grace mentioned her mismatched socks, something extraordinary happened. The corner of Thomas's mouth twitched, not the practice smile he used in board meetings, but an involuntary response to genuine amusement. It was small, nearly imperceptible, but for Thomas, it was seismic, a crack in foundations he'd spent years reinforcing. In that moment, as Grace continued her monologue, unaware of whose car she'd commandeered, Thomas made a decision that deviated from every behavioral pattern he'd established. Instead of correcting her mistake, he would see where this unexpected detour might lead, not for any strategic advantage or corporate gain, but because for the first time in years, he couldn't predict what would happen next. Perhaps it was the way she spoke without filter. Perhaps it was the absurdity of the situation. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that this woman's unplanned invasion of his space had done something his wealth couldn't buy. It had made him feel present, engaged, alive. The rain continued to beat against the windshield as Thomas made his choice. This woman, this Grace Stone, had no idea who he was, and there was something inexplicably valuable in that. To her, he wasn't Thomas Miller, CEO of Stonebridge Corporation, a man whose net worth could fund small nations. He was just a driver, a stranger, a human being. And when she finally paused her rambling to ask if he was her Uber driver, Thomas found himself answering with that simple no, not to end the encounter, but to see what might happen next. For a man who had spent decades avoiding uncertainty, This small act of curiosity was nothing short of revolutionary. While Thomas savored his small rebellion against routine, Grace was rushing toward a revelation that would make her rain-soaked car mishap seem trivial by comparison. Ever wonder what happens when the person you accidentally overshared with turns out to be the most powerful figure in your new workplace? That revolutionary moment of uncertainty was about to explode into the professional equivalent of a nightmare. Walking into your first day on the job, only to discover the stranger who witnessed your unfiltered morning meltdown isn't just another employee, but the person signing your paychecks. Grace hurried through the gleaming glass doors of Stonebridge Corporation, her still damp shoes squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. She moved with purpose, trying to blend seamlessly with the stream of employees heading toward the main conference room. The morning presentation with the new CEO was minutes away, and Grace silently thanked her lucky stars that the kind stranger in the black car had gotten her there just in time. Not a moment to spare, she whispered to herself, slipping into the conference room and finding an empty chair near the back. The room hummed with anticipation. Department heads in crisp suits arranging documents, assistants distributing folders, executives checking watches. Grace smoothed her blouse, discreetly tucking the loose button thread into her sleeve, and ran nervous fingers through her hair, hoping it had dried into something resembling professional. An administrative assistant handed her a folder labeled Quarterly Projections, which Grace accepted with a grateful nod. This was it, her chance to make a proper first impression after the chaos of her morning. She took a deep breath and straightened her posture, ready to begin anew. As she adjusted her position, Grace became acutely aware of her mismatched socks peeking out below her pant legs. She quickly tucked her feet beneath her chair, hoping no one would notice the colorful fashion emergency below her ankles. A quiet chuckle escaped her lips at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, somehow miraculously on time, despite everything. The room gradually quieted as the conference room door opened. Firm, measured footsteps approached from behind, and Grace kept her eyes forward, following protocol as the company's new CEO entered. The footsteps passed her chair and continued toward the front of the room. When they stopped, Grace finally looked up. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Standing at the head of the conference table, straightening his immaculate tie, was the man from the car, her supposed Uber driver, now being introduced as Thomas Miller, CEO of Stonebridge Corporation. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice carrying the same measured tone she'd heard in the car, but now weighted with unmistakable authority. "I appreciate you all being on time for our first official meeting together." The folder slipped from Grace's suddenly numb fingers, hitting the floor with a deafening thud that seemed to echo through the silent room. Papers scattered across the polished floor, and every head turned toward the source of the disruption. Grace felt her face burn as she scrambled to collect the documents, wishing desperately for the floor to open and swallow her whole. When she finally gathered the courage to look up again, Thomas Miller was watching her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and the ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The color drained from Grace's face as their gazes locked across the room. In that moment, she became painfully aware of every single word she had spoken in that car. Every complaint about her morning, every unfiltered comment about her financial struggles, every nervous ramble about her mismatched socks. "Before we begin," Thomas said, still holding her gaze, "I hope my arrival today didn't catch anyone off guard, especially those who might have mistaken me for an Uber driver." A ripple of confused laughter moved through the room as every eye turned toward Grace. She sat frozen in her chair, mentally scrolling through the highlight reel of her car ride confessions. Had she really told the CEO of Stonebridge Corporation about burning her tongue on coffee? Had she actually described in detail how her cheap umbrella had collapsed on her? The mortification was complete and overwhelming. Thomas Miller cleared his throat and continued, his expression now unreadable. "I mention this because it illustrates something important about our company culture moving forward. Sometimes, the most authentic moments happen when we step outside conventional boundaries." Grace held her breath, waiting for the public humiliation that would surely follow. Instead, Thomas turned slightly, addressing the entire room, but with words that created a bridge between their shared experience. "This morning, I had the opportunity to witness firsthand the determination of one of our newest team members," he said, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost like respect. In the face of considerable obstacles, this individual demonstrated persistence, resourcefulness, and the kind of unfiltered honesty that we should all aspire to bring to our professional interactions. The tension in Grace's shoulders began to ease slightly as Thomas continued. "Too often in corporate settings, we hide behind polished presentations and rehearsed responses. We lose the initiative and creativity that come from authentic engagement." His eyes found hers again. "Sometimes it takes someone jumping into your car and demanding you go, 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 to remind you what genuine human interaction feels like." A wave of laughter rippled through the room, but it wasn't derisive. It was appreciative, curious. Grace felt the weight of attention shift from embarrassment to something more like intrigue. Thomas had somehow transformed her mortifying mistake into a teachable moment about corporate culture. Leaders who can handle awkward situations with humor significantly improve workplace culture, Thomas continued, seamlessly weaving her faux pas into his vision for the company. Humor acts as a social lubricant, easing tension and fostering a more relaxed environment where employees feel comfortable expressing themselves and taking risks. As Thomas launched into his presentation, Grace slowly recovered her composure. He hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't fired her on the spot. Instead, he'd acknowledged their unusual encounter while maintaining professional boundaries, using it to illustrate broader points about company culture rather than singling her out for ridicule. When the meeting concluded 45 minutes later, Grace remained in her seat as others filed out, unsure whether to approach him or pretend the whole thing never happened. Before she could decide, Thomas paused by her chair. "Ms. Stone," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "I believe we've already had quite an introduction this morning." Grace looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Mr. Miller," she managed, finding her voice at last. "I can explain." He raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No explanation necessary. Your unconventional approach certainly made for a memorable first impression." Then, with the slightest softening around his eyes, he added, "Though next time, perhaps check the license plate before commandeering a vehicle." As he walked away, Grace realized something profound had shifted in that moment of public recognition. She hadn't just made a mortifying mistake. She'd inadvertently created a unique connection with the most powerful person in the company. Their relationship had begun on the most unusual foundation imaginable, authentic human interaction that completely bypassed the typical corporate hierarchy. Little did Grace know that bypassing the hierarchy had placed her directly in Thomas's line of sight, not as a target for ridicule, but as the unwitting subject of his most unconventional management experiment yet. Most executives would have either ignored her blunder or used it as grounds for dismissal. Thomas Miller, however, saw something different, a rare opportunity to observe raw talent operating outside the constraints of corporate protocol. 3 days after their memorable encounter, Grace received an email that sent her stomach plummeting to her shoes. "Please report to the CEO's office at 2 p.m. sharp." The message was as brief as it was terrifying. She spent the morning rehearsing apologies and updating her resume, certain this would be her final day at Stonebridge Corporation. When she arrived at Thomas's imposingly minimalist office, he didn't even look up from his computer. "Ms. Stone, I need your assistance with some operational matters in the West Wing." His tone gave away nothing as he handed her a folder. "Report your findings directly to me by end of day." Grace opened the folder expecting termination papers. Instead, she found a detailed checklist of maintenance issues, everything from flickering lights to malfunctioning coffee machines. This wasn't the job of a marketing assistant. This was janitorial work. "I don't understand," she stammered. "Shouldn't facilities management handle this?" Thomas finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "I need fresh eyes on these recurring problems. Sometimes the best insights come from unexpected sources." Before she could respond, he returned to his screen. "That will be all, Ms. Stone." The message was clear. Complete this strange assignment, or pack your desk. Grace spent the next 6 hours crawling through ceiling panels, testing electrical outlets, and examining every coffee machine on the floor. She filled 5 pages with detailed notes, discovering patterns the maintenance team had overlooked, like how the flickering lights corresponded with the hourly cycling of the building's HVAC system. When she returned to Thomas's office, disheveled and exhausted, he merely nodded at her report. "Interesting observations. I'll review these thoroughly." No thank you, no explanation. Just the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. The next morning, another cryptic email appeared in her inbox. This time, Grace found herself tasked with diagnosing a stubborn paper jam in the executive floor's primary printer, a machine that had defeated 3 technicians already. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, kneeling beside the massive machine in her pencil skirt. An hour later, she was practically inside the printer, ink smudged across her cheek, her blouse partially caught in the paper tray, when she heard a familiar voice. "Making progress, Ms. Stone?" Grace jerked upright, banging her head on the printer's upper housing. Thomas stood there, impeccably dressed as always, watching her struggle with undisguised interest. "I found the problem," she said, refusing to show embarrassment. "Someone's been loading letterhead paper backward and jamming the internal sensors. But more importantly, whoever ordered this model ignored that it's completely wrong for your printing volume. You need the 9,000, not this outdated 7,500. Thomas's eyebrow raised slightly. "Interesting assessment. And what makes you certain of that?" Without hesitation, Grace launched into a detailed explanation of printer specifications and workflow efficiency she'd learned during a college job at an office supply store. The words flowed effortlessly, her confidence growing with each point. When she finished, Thomas merely nodded. "Have your recommendation on my desk tomorrow morning." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Miss Stone, you might want to address that ink stain before your meeting with accounting." Grace's assignments grew increasingly complex. Next came reviewing the company's annual financial report, a high-stakes task where a single misplaced decimal could trigger a shareholder panic. Though she had no formal financial training, Grace approached it with the same methodical attention she'd given the maintenance issues, flagging inconsistencies and asking questions that made the accounting team squirm. A pattern emerged. Thomas would assign tasks completely outside her job description, observe her approach, then immediately present a new challenge. One day she was reorganizing the supply chain logistics, the next facilitating negotiations with a difficult vendor. Each assignment seemed designed to push her beyond her comfort zone in some specific way. Her colleagues noticed the special attention. During a rare lunch break, Rachel from HR leaned in conspiratorially. "Miller is testing your limits, you know. Nobody gets this kind of direct attention from him." Grace stabbed at her salad. "He's not testing my limits. He's testing my sanity. Yesterday, he had me review the employee benefits package. And today, I'm supposed to assess the ergonomics of every workstation on the executive floor. You don't see it, do you?" Rachel smiled knowingly. "These aren't random tasks. He's throwing you into situations where conventional employees would fail, but you keep surprising him. By not getting fired?" Grace scoffed. "By approaching problems differently. Miller has a theory about identifying talent through unconventional challenges rather than traditional assessments. You're basically his current case study." That evening, exhausted after reconfiguring 23 desk setups, Grace found Thomas waiting by the elevator. "Your evaluation of the workstations was thorough," he said, holding her report. "Particularly your suggestion about natural lighting optimization." "Thank you," she replied cautiously. "Tell me, Ms. Stone, why did you examine the break room when it wasn't part of your assignment?" Grace hesitated. "Because people don't just work at desks. The environment as a whole affects productivity. The break room's current setup forces employees to face blank walls instead of each other. It kills conversation and makes breaks feel like another task instead of actual rest." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a subtle relaxation around his eyes. "Most consultants I've hired missed that entirely, despite their ergonomic expertise." The elevator arrived, and he stepped inside. "I'll expect your proposal for the client presentation tomorrow." "Good evening, Ms. Stone." As the doors closed, Grace leaned against the wall, realizing what had just happened. This wasn't punishment for her mistaken identity blunder. Each task had been deliberately chosen to reveal something about her capabilities, how she approached problems, how she communicated findings, how she handled pressure. These tests weren't designed to humiliate her. They were Thomas's unorthodox method of evaluation. While other executives relied on resumes and interviews, Thomas Miller created real-world scenarios that revealed a person's authentic strengths and weaknesses. He wasn't just seeing if she could do the job. He was discovering what job she could do. That night, instead of updating her resume, Grace began preparing for the client presentation with renewed determination. For the first time, she understood that Thomas wasn't trying to drive her away. He saw potential in her that even she hadn't recognized, an ability to approach challenges with fresh perspective and practical solutions. The presentation went flawlessly, but Grace had no idea her biggest test wasn't in the boardroom at all. It was waiting for her at the company's quarterly mixer with a deceptively friendly smile and a recorder tucked discreetly into a jacket pocket. The corporate world had taught her to navigate spreadsheets and client expectations, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when casual conversation would transform her from background employee to the company's unexpected marketing sensation. "So, what's it like working with the mysterious Thomas Miller?" The question came from a woman who'd introduced herself as Melissa, making small talk over appetizers at Stonebridge's networking event. With a champagne flute in one hand and the confidence that comes from finally feeling secure in her position, Grace didn't think twice about answering honestly. "Thomas?" Grace laughed, relaxing into the conversation. "He's intense, mysterious, a little intimidating. He demands more coffee than a cafe and more reports than an audit. But honestly, he makes it work." She took another sip of champagne, warming to her topic. "Everyone thinks he's this emotionless corporate machine, but there's definitely a sense of humor hiding in there. You just have to earn the right to see it." The conversation continued pleasantly for another 15 minutes, with Grace sharing anecdotes about her unconventional path at Stonebridge. She thought nothing more of it until the following morning, when her phone exploded with notifications. Rachel, her co-worker, sent a frantic text with a link. Grace, what did you do?" The headline made her stomach drop. "Employee reveals secrets of Stonebridge Corporation's mysterious new CEO." There was her face, captured mid-laugh, alongside a professional headshot of Thomas, looking characteristically serious. The friendly Melissa had been a reporter for Business Insider, and Grace's candid impressions now filled the screen in bold quotes. "I'm dead," Grace whispered, scrolling through the article with trembling fingers. Her innocent observations about Thomas's management style, his hidden humor, and even her impression of his intimidating presence were featured prominently. The comments section beneath the article was already filling with reactions. "I want a mysterious CEO in my life too. She's hilarious. Let her host the company's channel. Most honest corporate interview I've ever read. Is Stonebridge hiring? Sign me up for the Thomas Miller experience." Grace barely made it through her morning routine, certain that her desk would be cleaned out by the time she arrived. She'd been candid about the CEO to a reporter, without authorization, without media training, without even realizing she was being interviewed. In the corporate world, this kind of unauthorized commentary was career suicide. The silence as she walked through the office was deafening. Colleagues watched her pass, with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed curiosity. Her email pinged with a message from Thomas's assistant. "Mr. Miller requests your presence in his office immediately." Walking toward the executive suite felt like approaching the executioner's block. Grace rehearsed various versions of her resignation, wondering if she could still get a reference from her direct supervisor after this disaster. When she entered Thomas's office, he was standing by the window, his back to the door. "Close the door, please," he said without turning around. When he finally faced her, his expression was unreadable. "I thought we should discuss your media debut." Grace started to apologize, but Thomas held up his hand, stopping her. He picked up his tablet and began reciting her quotes with unnerving precision. "He demands more coffee than a cafe, and more reports than an audit. Everyone thinks he's this emotionless corporate machine." He set the tablet down and fixed her with that penetrating gaze. "Is that really how you see me, Grace?" "I didn't know she was a reporter," Grace explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But yes, that is how I see you. I was being honest. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a micro-movement most people would miss. Honesty is rare in corporate settings. Usually, we pay consultants thousands of dollars to tell us what people really think. He turned his screen toward her, showing the company's job application portal. HR has reported a 63% increase in applications since yesterday. Many specifically mention wanting to work with the mysterious CEO you described. He scrolled to show her the analytics. The article has been shared over 20,000 times across social media platforms. Grace blinked, struggling to process this unexpected turn. So, I'm not fired? The corner of Thomas's mouth twitched. That ghost of a smile she'd mentioned in the interview. On the contrary, the marketing department has requested you join their meeting this afternoon. They believe your authentic communication style could be valuable for our rebranding efforts. It turned out that Grace's candid interview had accidentally aligned perfectly with Stonebridge's new strategic direction. In a market saturated with polished corporate messaging, her genuine observations had cut through the noise, making the company appear more relatable and human. What should have been a PR disaster had instead showcased the exact quality the company was trying to cultivate: authenticity. People are tired of rehearsed corporate speak, Thomas explained, leaning back in his chair. Your interview put a human face on leadership, mine, specifically, that resonated with people. The marketing team wants to leverage that connection. In the weeks that followed, Grace found herself in a surprising new role. The marketing department invited her to participate in a series of internal videos, where her natural, conversational style helped translate complex company initiatives into accessible content. Her spontaneous humor and straightforward approach became an asset rather than a liability. The company's social media engagement doubled, with followers responding enthusiastically to the more authentic voice Grace had inadvertently pioneered. Job applications continued to increase, with candidates specifically mentioning the company culture they'd glimpsed through Grace's candid interview. One afternoon, Thomas stopped by her desk, something that would have been unimaginable before the article. The board received the quarterly report today, he said, resting his hand on the edge of her desk. Applications are up 78% compared to last quarter. Employee engagement metrics have improved across all departments. Grace looked up from her computer. All because I couldn't keep my mouth shut at a company mixer? Thomas actually smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. Because you were authentic when everyone else was being strategic. You weren't trying to impress anyone or advance your career. You were just, He paused, studying her with that intense gaze that had once intimidated her. You're not just spontaneous, Grace. You're captivating. Your ability to connect with people, to say what others are thinking, but won't express. It's valuable, more valuable than I initially realized. As he walked away, Grace realized how dramatically her position had shifted. What should have been a catastrophic mistake had instead become the catalyst for her transformation from temporary employee to recognized company asset. In a corporate world obsessed with calculation and strategy, her greatest professional advantage had turned out to be the quality she couldn't control: her authentic self. Grace had mastered the art of authenticity in the corporate world, but Thomas was about to present her with a challenge that would test her ability to be something she wasn't. Ever wonder what happens when a CEO who values candor suddenly needs someone to play pretend? The lines between professional strategy and personal connection were about to blur in ways neither of them anticipated. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, its formal language masking what would become a pivotal moment in Grace's relationship with Thomas Miller. Your presence is requested at the Bellamy Hotel this Friday evening to accompany me for a strategic investor dinner. Professional attire required. Details to follow. No explanation, no context, just a directive that left Grace staring at her computer screen with raised eyebrows. When she arrived at Thomas's office for clarification, his usually composed demeanor seemed slightly off balance. He paced behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, before finally explaining the situation. Miss Delaney is one of our most important investors, he said, his voice maintaining that practiced CEO neutrality. She's also developed a personal interest that I'd prefer to redirect toward professional matters. Grace crossed her arms. You need me to be your shield. Thomas winced at the bluntness, but nodded. I need someone who can create strategic interruptions whenever conversations veer into inappropriate territory. Someone who knows how to read a room and act accordingly. So I'm your corporate bodyguard against unwanted romantic advances, Grace said, unable to hide her amusement. I'd prefer strategic ally, Thomas corrected, though the corner of his mouth twitched. He handed her a folder containing Miss Delaney's investment history and personal background. One more thing, he added, as Grace turned to leave. Wear something that says you're smart, but also a little dangerous. Grace paused at the door. Dangerous? That's not in my corporate wardrobe description. You managed to accidentally hijack my car and still keep your job. I think you can figure it out, Thomas replied, surprising her with the rare reference to their unusual first meeting. Friday evening arrived, with Grace stepping out of her comfort zone in a midnight blue dress that balanced professional with something indefinably more. The Bellamy Hotel's restaurant gleamed with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths, a setting designed to impress even the wealthiest investors. Thomas was waiting in the lobby, his usual impeccable suit, complemented by a tie that, Grace noticed with surprise, matched the exact shade of her dress. His eyes widened slightly as she approached, a momentary crack in his careful composure. You clean up well, Miss Stone, he said, his voice carrying a note she hadn't heard before. You sound surprised, Mr. Miller, she replied. Did you expect me to show up in mismatched socks? His smile was brief, but genuine. Miss Delaney arrives in 15 minutes. Remember the signals we discussed. The dinner began with polite introductions and business small talk. Miss Delaney, elegant, poised, and laser-focused on Thomas, barely acknowledged Grace's existence until Thomas introduced her as the company's newest asset, with an unparalleled talent for problem-solving. Grace observed the dynamic with fascination. Miss Delaney's interest in Thomas was unmistakable, from the lingering glances to the way she leaned forward whenever he spoke, her questions gradually shifting from company projections to his personal life. I've always wondered what a man like you does to unwind, Thomas, Miss Delaney said, her voice dropping to a more intimate register as she touched his arm. Thomas gave Grace the signal, a small adjustment of his tie, and she immediately jumped in. Mr. Miller, your tie looks crooked, Grace interrupted, reaching across to adjust it unnecessarily. You mentioned that presentation you wanted me to review before Monday? The one about investment diversification strategies? Throughout the evening, Grace executed perfect interruptions with increasing creativity. When Miss Delaney suggested she and Thomas continue their conversation over drinks in the hotel bar, Grace smoothly interjected, Mr. Miller, we need to check that urgent report on people who interfere with formal dinners. The data is quite revealing. The humor in her eyes as she said it caused Thomas to nearly choke on his water, a reaction that seemed to genuinely startle Miss Delaney, who had apparently never witnessed the CEO display actual emotion. What began as a professional strategy slowly transformed as the evening progressed. The carefully maintained wall between boss and employee began to crack as Grace's interruptions became inside jokes that only Thomas understood, creating a bubble of shared humor in the formal setting. By the time dessert arrived, something unexpected had happened. Thomas and Grace had developed a rhythm, a natural give and take that made them appear more like longtime partners than colleagues. The pretense had begun to feel strangely authentic. When Miss Delaney excused herself to take a call, Thomas leaned closer to Grace. You're remarkably good at this, he said, his voice lower than usual. Saving CEOs from uncomfortable situations? Grace smiled. Should I add it to my resume? I've never seen Miss Delaney so thoroughly redirected, he admitted. Usually, she's quite persistent. Maybe she's just not used to seeing you engage with someone as an actual human being instead of a corporate robot, Grace suggested, the champagne emboldening her candor. Thomas's expression shifted to something more thoughtful. Is that how everyone sees me? Not everyone, Grace replied, meeting his gaze directly. Not anymore. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was prepared to name, until Miss Delaney returned to the table. As the evening concluded, Thomas insisted on walking Grace to her car. The night air held a crisp chill that made their shared warmth more noticeable as they walked side by side through the hotel's garden path. "You were perfect," Thomas said as they reached her car, his voice carrying unexpected warmth. "I can't remember the last business dinner I actually enjoyed." Grace smiled as she unlocked her door. "I expect fair compensation for my services. Full week, with no surprise reports." The laugh that escaped him was genuine and unguarded, a sound so rare that Grace found herself staring. In that moment, illuminated by the soft glow of the garden lights, Thomas Miller looked nothing like the intimidating CEO who had built walls around himself. He looked like a man discovering something he'd forgotten existed. "What?" he asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing," Grace replied. "It's just nice to hear you laugh. Real laughter, not the corporate kind." As she prepared to get into her car, Thomas said something that clearly wasn't rehearsed or calculated. "You look dangerous tonight." The comment hung in the air between them, crossing an invisible boundary that had defined their relationship until now. Grace paused, her hand on the car door, and looked back at him. "And you almost looked human," she replied softly, her voice lacking its usual shield of humor. Their eyes held for a moment longer than professionally appropriate before Grace slipped into her driver's seat, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. What had begun as a strategic business arrangement had revealed the undeniable chemistry developing beneath their professional roles. Chemistry was one thing, but true connection? That's revealed in moments of weakness, not strength. When Thomas Miller walked into the office with strategic congestion and tissues hidden in his desk drawer, no one expected Grace to challenge the unwritten rule about keeping your distance from a sick CEO. Grace immediately noticed something was off the moment she stepped into the office that morning. The always impeccable CEO had arrived, looking decidedly less than perfect. His normally crisp appearance was marred by a reddened nose and watery eyes that no amount of corporate polish could disguise. As Thomas walked past her desk, she caught the unmistakable sound of congestion in his usually commanding voice. Throughout the morning meeting, Thomas struggled to maintain his authoritative presence. His voice cracked during his presentation on quarterly projections, and he paused several times to discreetly dab at his nose with a handkerchief. When questioned about his condition, he dismissed it with practiced nonchalance, referring to it as merely strategic congestion, a term that made Grace roll her eyes behind her notebook. What fascinated Grace wasn't just that Thomas was sick, it was how desperately he was trying to hide it. Back at his office, she observed through the glass wall as he quickly tucked tissues into his desk drawer whenever someone approached. His wastebasket told the real story, filled with crumpled evidence of his battle against what appeared to be a vicious cold. "Men in power," Grace muttered to herself, shaking her head. "They'd rather collapse than admit they're human." Instead of maintaining the professional distance that everyone else carefully preserved, Grace took an unexpected approach. During her lunch break, she slipped out to a nearby market and returned with supplies: a thermos of homemade ginger tea with lemon and honey, a container of chicken soup from the deli on the corner, and vitamin C supplements. When she knocked on Thomas's door and entered without waiting for his usual formal "come in," his expression shifted from surprise to confusion as she placed the items on his desk. He stared at her offerings as though she'd brought him some exotic, unidentifiable creature. "What is this?" he asked, his voice now unmistakably nasal. "This," Grace replied matter-of-factly, "is what normal humans need when they're fighting off a virus that's clearly winning the battle." Thomas's brow furrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm perfectly—" A sudden sneeze interrupted his denial. "Your voice sounds like a duck with sinusitis," Grace said, crossing her arms. "And your secret tissue stash isn't as secret as you think." For a moment, Thomas looked genuinely thrown off balance. In the corporate world where vulnerability was treated as weakness, Grace's direct acknowledgement of his condition was unprecedented. No one spoke to him this way, with concern rather than deference. "I appreciate the thought, but this is unnecessary," he said, attempting to regain his composure. "I have 3 meetings this afternoon, and you'll be spreading whatever plague you've caught to everyone in those meetings." Grace interrupted. "Very strategic." To her surprise, a small smile cracked through Thomas's professional veneer. He looked at the steaming thermos and reluctantly reached for it. What's in this? Ginger tea with honey and lemon. My grandmother's recipe. It won't cure you, but it'll help you sound less like you're speaking through a kazoo. Throughout the day, Grace continued her campaign of care. She refilled his tea twice, discreetly placed more tissues on his desk when his supply ran low, and interrupted one particularly long conference call with a note that simply read, "Take the vitamin C, or I'll start making announcements about your condition over the intercom." By mid-afternoon, Thomas's condition had visibly worsened. His eyes were glazed, and his forehead felt warm when Grace boldly placed her hand there during what was supposed to be a brief document review. "That's it," she declared. "You're going home." "I have a board call at 4, Thomas protested weakly. "If you collapse in here, HR is going to get blamed," Grace countered. "Do you want Sarah from HR to have to explain to the board why the CEO is unconscious because he was too stubborn to take a sick day?" Thomas looked at her with a mix of frustration and something else, perhaps a grudging appreciation for her audacity. After a long pause, where they simply stared at each other, he finally conceded. "Fine, I'll go home," he said, gathering his things. "But only if you promise to leave me alone for a day." "Deal," Grace replied with a triumphant smile. "But only if you promise to actually rest, instead of working remotely until midnight." As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "This isn't how people usually interact with me, you know." "I know," Grace said simply. "Maybe that's the problem." The next morning, Grace arrived at work, unsure of what to expect. Thomas's schedule showed he'd taken a rare sick day, something his assistant mentioned hadn't happened in over 3 years. When she reached her desk, she noticed something that hadn't been there the day before: a small gift bag. Inside was a bar of premium dark chocolate and a keychain. Not just any keychain, but one shaped like a penguin, wearing a tiny hockey helmet and holding a stick. Grace stared at it, momentarily confused, until the memory clicked into place during their first car ride, when she'd rambled nervously about her mismatched socks. She'd mentioned her collection of quirky keychains and how her favorite featured a hockey-playing penguin that had been lost months ago. Attached was a simple note in Thomas's precise handwriting. "Thank you for the tea, and for not pretending." Grace turned the keychain over in her hand, aware of the significance of this small object. Thomas hadn't just remembered a throwaway comment from weeks ago. He'd gone out of his way to find a replacement for something she'd mentioned losing. In the corporate world of strategic advantages and calculated moves, this wasn't a business gesture. It was personal. Personal gestures speak volumes, but the true language of connection reveals itself through moments shared in public. That evening, a simple exchange on a dance floor would transform what had been building between Grace and Thomas into something undeniable. The annual holiday gala at Stonebridge Corporation was the social event of the year. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the hotel ballroom as employees arrived in their finest attire, ready to celebrate another successful year. Grace stood at the entrance, smoothing down her emerald green dress, a splurge she hadn't been able to resist despite her budget constraints. She'd spent an hour perfecting her makeup, paying special attention to her boldly applied red lipstick. "Someone's making an effort tonight," Rachel teased, appearing beside Grace with 2 glasses of champagne. "And I don't think it's for the free appetizers. It's just a company event," Grace insisted, accepting the champagne with a grateful smile. "Professional boundaries, remember? Besides, I haven't seen him all evening." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You haven't seen him, but you've checked for him. That's different." Grace was about to protest when the crowd near the entrance shifted, and Thomas Miller walked in. Outside the confines of his corporate office, he looked different, his tailored tuxedo accentuating his athletic frame, his usual serious expression softened by the festive atmosphere. Without the barrier of his desk between them, without the weight of quarterly reports and corporate hierarchy, he appeared more approachable, more human, more relaxed, Rachel whispered, following Grace's gaze, and definitely more dangerous. Grace felt her pulse quicken as Thomas scanned the room, his eyes eventually finding hers. He nodded slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting in that almost smile she'd come to recognize. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer. "I need some air," Grace murmured, but Rachel blocked her path. "Too late. He's coming over." And he was. Thomas moved through the crowd with purpose, stopping occasionally to shake hands with board members and executives. But his trajectory was clear. When he finally reached Grace, the atmosphere between them immediately changed, charged with something neither had acknowledged until now. "You look different tonight," Thomas said, his eyes taking in her appearance. "Different good? Or different concerning?" Grace asked, falling into their familiar pattern of banter. "Different surprising," he replied, in the best possible way. Their conversation flowed naturally, moving beyond work topics to books they'd both read and places they hoped to visit. It was the longest they'd spoken without professional pretense, and Grace found herself relaxing into the exchange, forgetting the eyes that occasionally glanced their way. "Grace, is that you?" The voice from behind her sent an unpleasant jolt through her body. She turned to find Nate, her ex-boyfriend, standing there with a drink in hand. His presence at the gala was unexpected and unwelcome. He worked for a partner company that occasionally collaborated with Stonebridge. "Nate, what are you doing here?" Grace asked, her voice tight. "Client invitation," he explained, his gaze moving between Grace and Thomas. "You look amazing. It's been what, 8 months?" "9, Grace corrected, feeling Thomas shift closer to her side. "You never returned my calls," Nate continued, oblivious to the tension. "I thought we could talk, maybe get a coffee sometime, and—" "I believe Grace is occupied at the moment," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a tone Grace had never heard before. Protective, possessive, almost. Nate's expression hardened as he recognized Thomas. "Mr. Miller, I didn't realize, are you two, right now? I'm offering her company," Thomas replied coolly. "Something you apparently didn't do very well." The statement hung in the air between them, bold and unmistakable in its implication. Nate opened his mouth to respond, thought better of it, and retreated with a mumbled excuse about finding colleagues. Grace turned to Thomas, surprised by his intervention. "That was inappropriate," Thomas suggested, a hint of regret crossing his features. "I was going to say unexpected," Grace replied, "but appreciated." Before Thomas could respond, the orchestra began a new song, and the MC announced it was time for everyone to join the dance floor. Couples moved forward, filling the open space with swirling colors and laughter. Thomas watched the dancers for a moment, then extended his hand to Grace in a gesture that defied his usual avoidance of such traditions. "Would you like to dance?" The question was simple, but its implications were not. This wasn't a task assignment or a professional courtesy. This was a choice, a deliberate step across the line they'd both been careful not to cross. Grace placed her hand in his. "I thought CEOs didn't dance." "This one doesn't," Thomas admitted, as he led her to the floor. "But I am willing to make an exception." As they moved into position, Thomas's hand settling at her waist, Grace was acutely aware of the physical proximity between them. The formal stance of ballroom dancing created a framework of intimacy that was both structured and profoundly personal. His palm against hers felt different than their businesslike handshakes, warmer, more deliberate. As they began to move with the music, something remarkable happened. The careful distance Thomas maintained from everyone, not just Grace, but the world, began to dissolve. His movements became more fluid, his expression more open. The dance floor created a space where the usual rules of their relationship no longer applied. "You're full of surprises," Grace said, following his lead as they moved through the other couples. "I didn't expect you to know how to dance." "There's a lot you don't know about me," Thomas replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. As they continued to dance, the ballroom seemed to disappear around them. The music slowed, and their steps followed suit, bringing them closer together. In this physical synchronicity, their connection deepened beyond words, a shared moment of unity that transcended their usual dynamic. "You've done something to me," Thomas finally whispered, his voice carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability. "You've thrown me off balance, taken me out of control, out of my logic, and now you're pulling me out of my comfort zone." The confession hung between them, honest and unguarded, in a way that Thomas Miller rarely allowed himself to be. Grace looked up at him, seeing not her boss, but simply a man who had finally lowered his defenses. "I'm going to ask you out," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But not as the CEO, as Thomas. The music continued around them, but they had stopped dancing, standing still amidst the moving couples. "I might say yes," Grace replied, her heart racing, but not as an employee, as Grace. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. The dance had created a shared experience that made their connection tangible and real, breaking down emotional barriers that had kept them apart. What had been building since that first car ride, the tension, the chemistry, the growing affection, was finally acknowledged. As the song ended, neither moved immediately to separate. This wasn't just a dance, it was a declaration. Their relationship had officially transcended professional boundaries, stepping into territory that was as thrilling as it was uncertain. That transcendent moment on the dance floor should have been the beginning of their story, not the end. But within days, Thomas's warmth had turned to ice, leaving Grace to wonder if vulnerability itself was the enemy he'd been fighting all along. Monday morning arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Grace stepped into the office with a hopeful smile, still floating on the memory of Thomas's words and the way he'd held her during their dance. She spotted him across the lobby, her heart skipping as she raised her hand to wave. But instead of the warm acknowledgement she expected, Thomas merely nodded, his expression as impenetrable as concrete, before disappearing into the elevator. "Did I imagine everything?" Grace whispered to herself, frozen in place as other employees streamed around her. Over the next 3 days, the pattern became unmistakable. Thomas wasn't just maintaining professional distance, he was actively avoiding her. The man who had whispered intimate confessions on the dance floor now communicated exclusively through formal emails, each one signed with his full title rather than his name. Where once there had been warmth, now there was only corporate protocol. "Has anyone seen Mr. Miller today?" Grace asked casually at the coffee station, trying to mask her confusion. Rachel gave her a curious look. "He's been in back-to-back meetings since 7 a.m. Why? Did he assign you another impossible task?" Grace forced a laugh, just wondering if my printer diagnosis skills would be needed again. But inside, her stomach twisted with uncertainty. Had she misread everything? Had that dance floor moment meant something entirely different to him? By Thursday, the emotional whiplash had become unbearable. The distance between them stretched like an endless corridor, and Grace found herself staring at the ceiling each night, replaying their dance in her mind, searching for the moment where everything had gone wrong. What hurt most wasn't the professional distance, but the personal erasure, as if their connection had been nothing more than a temporary glitch in his operating system, now efficiently corrected. Every time she crossed paths with Thomas in the hallway, he would suddenly find something urgent to discuss with whoever was closest, his eyes never quite meeting hers. Finally, after a week of this emotional exile, Grace made her decision. She straightened her desk, applied a fresh coat of lipstick, and marched toward the executive floor with determination in every step. "I need 5 minutes," she told his assistant, who looked up in surprise at her assertive tone. "He's preparing for the board meeting tomorrow." "It's about the Davidson account," Grace lied smoothly, using the name of their most important client as her passport. Thomas was hunched over spreadsheets when she entered, his jacket draped over his chair and sleeves rolled up, a rare glimpse of the man behind the perfectly tailored armor. For just a moment, before he registered her presence, his face showed signs of the exhaustion he'd been hiding. "Thomas," Grace began, deliberately using his first name, crossing the invisible line he'd redrawn between them. His posture stiffened immediately. "Ms. Stone," he responded without looking up. "I believe the correct address is Mr. Miller." The correction landed like a slap. Grace inhaled sharply, fighting to maintain her composure. "That's actually why I'm here. Last week you were Thomas. You were a person who danced with me, who admitted I'd thrown you off balance. Now you're acting like none of it happened." For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioning. When Thomas finally looked up, his expression was carefully blank. What happened at the gala was a moment outside protocol, a brief departure from standard operating procedure. His voice was measured, clinical. "It would be best for both our professional futures if we maintained appropriate boundaries." Grace felt as if the floor beneath her was crumbling. A moment outside protocol? Is that what you call it when you tell someone they've changed your life? When you ask them out? I wasn't thinking clearly, he replied, his hands resting flat on the desk, as if bracing himself. It was inappropriate of me to blur professional lines, the perfect words, the perfect posture, the perfect emotional distance. It was like watching someone retreat behind bulletproof glass, visible, but entirely unreachable. "I see," Grace said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside her. "Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Miller." She turned to leave, but at the door, something made her pause. Perhaps it was the desperation to salvage even a piece of what they'd shared, or maybe it was simply her refusal to let him rewrite their story so easily. "The problem with moments outside protocol, Thomas," she said without turning back, "is they stay with you. And when you pretend they never happened, the other person is left trying to erase something that's already part of their memory." The silence that followed her out felt heavier than any response could have been. That night, Grace cried for the first time since her grandfather's funeral 3 years earlier. Not delicate, cinematic tears, but messy, ugly sobs that left her eyes puffy and her pillowcase damp. What hurt most wasn't losing Thomas. It was losing the possibility of him, the version she'd glimpsed beneath the corporate facade. Morning arrived with bloodshot eyes and a resolve to match his professional distance with her own. If Thomas Miller wanted nothing more than an efficient employee, that's exactly what he would get. No more spontaneous jokes, no more challenging his perspectives, no more of the authentic connection that had apparently terrified him into retreat. But when Grace arrived at her desk, something unexpected was waiting. A cream-colored envelope with her name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the kind used for formal company letterhead. But the message was anything but formal. "I'm trying to protect what's left of my rationality. I'm the kind of person who ruins what he touches, and you deserve everything that's light. Everything I still don't know how to be." The words were like finally seeing the blueprint to a complex machine. Suddenly, everything made sense. His retreat wasn't rejection. It was fear, disguised as professionalism. The man who controlled every aspect of his life with meticulous precision was terrified of the one thing he couldn't control. The vulnerability that came with real connection. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace honored his request for distance, matching his formality with precision. Their interactions became a carefully choreographed dance of polite nods and efficient exchanges. But something had shifted in the way she carried herself. No longer desperate for his attention, but quietly confident in the knowledge that his withdrawal wasn't about her inadequacy, but his fear. In meetings, she noticed how his eyes would linger on her when he thought no one was watching, how he sometimes opened his mouth as if to say something personal before redirecting to business matters. The professional mask never slipped, but beneath it, she sensed a growing struggle, a man fighting against his own walls while simultaneously reinforcing them. The walls he'd spent a lifetime building were starting to crack, revealing glimpses of the man trapped behind his own defenses. What happens when a CEO who controls every variable in his life faces the one equation he can't solve? The undeniable truth that some risks are worth taking precisely because they can't be calculated. The gold-embossed invitation arrived on Grace's desk on a Tuesday morning. "End of cycle dinner, honoring outstanding employee," it read in elegant script, with her name listed prominently as the guest of honor. After weeks of maintaining perfect professional distance, this formal recognition felt like Thomas's way of closing their chapter with dignified finality. Grace spent hours preparing for the event, selecting a silver dress that shimmered under the lights of the grand ballroom. When she arrived, colleagues congratulated her. Executives shook her hand, but one person remained conspicuously absent. Thomas Miller himself. "He's tied up with investors," his assistant explained when Grace inquired, "but he specifically requested we proceed with your recognition." As the evening progressed, Grace smiled through conversations, nodded appropriately during the presentations, but the hollow feeling in her chest expanded with each passing hour. By the time her name was called to receive the Crystal Award commemorating her contributions, she had already mentally packed away their almost relationship into the box labeled professional experience. Standing at the podium, Grace looked out at her colleagues and found unexpected strength in the authenticity that had brought her this far. "Thank you all for this recognition," she began, her voice steady, despite her churning emotions. "I've learned that sometimes the most ridiculous mistakes are the ones that put us on the right path. 6 months ago, I jumped into the wrong car thinking it was my Uber, and somehow that led me here. Life doesn't always follow a spreadsheet, does it? The crowd laughed, unaware of the deeper meaning behind her words. As the applause faded, Grace collected her belongings, the crystal award heavy in her hand. It was time to go home, to move forward, to accept that some connections weren't meant to last beyond their moment. She had just reached the hallway when a familiar voice stopped her. "I almost lost you twice." Grace turned to find Thomas standing there, not in his usual impeccable suit, but in a simple black shirt, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "First when you walked out of my office thinking I didn't care," he continued, taking a cautious step toward her. "And then, when I sent that letter, believing I was protecting you by pushing you away." The ballroom noise faded to a distant hum as Grace stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this unexpected moment. "I was afraid, Grace," he admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Afraid of mixing what I felt with what I thought I was supposed to be. But you showed me that feeling is exactly what I was missing." Grace clutched her award tighter. "You've been avoiding me for weeks." "I needed to understand what was happening to me," Thomas explained, his usual confidence replaced by something far more genuine. "My entire life has been built around control and prediction. Spreadsheets don't fail, systems don't disappoint. But people, relationships, they're unpredictable. So am I just another unpredictable variable in your life equation?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Thomas shook his head, a smile breaking through his serious expression. "You're the variable that made me question the entire equation." He reached for her hand, hesitantly. "I've spent my life building walls to keep emotions at bay, thinking vulnerability was weakness. It took someone mistaking me for an Uber driver to make me realize how much I'd missed by hiding behind those walls." He paused, searching her eyes. "I know I'm complicated. I overthink, I analyze, I retreat when things get too real. But I'm asking for the chance to be with you. Not as your CEO, not as Thomas Miller of Stonebridge Corporation. Just as a man who found something irreplaceable when you jumped into my car that morning." Grace's breath caught as she processed his words. "How do I know you won't retreat again the next time you're scared?" "Because I've learned that the fear of losing you is far greater than the fear of being vulnerable with you," he answered simply. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Not just a professional boundary crossed, but a mutual recognition that their connection transcended conventional categories. 3 weeks later, Thomas led Grace up the staircase to the company rooftop. When he opened the door, she gasped at the transformation. String lights hung in gentle arcs across the space, creating a canopy of stars below the actual night sky. Flowers cascaded from custom-built pergolas, their scent mingling with the cool evening air. Soft music played from hidden speakers, transforming the corporate rooftop into an intimate sanctuary. "How did you do all this?" Grace whispered, taking in the scene. Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that had become increasingly common. "I have my resources, though I must admit, the florist was quite confused when I specifically requested mismatched flower arrangements." Grace laughed, remembering her mismatched socks from their first encounter. "You remembered." "I remember everything about you," Thomas replied, leading her to the center of the rooftop where a small table held a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "Your honesty woke something in me that had been dormant for too long." As they stood beneath the lights, Thomas took both her hands in his. "When you first jumped into my car, you were a complete mystery. A woman with mismatched socks and determination in her eyes. I had no spreadsheet for how to respond, no strategic plan for the feelings you stirred in me." Grace squeezed his hands, encouraging him to continue, as she noticed the unusual tremor in his usually steady voice. "I've spent my life avoiding vulnerability, believing it made me weak," Thomas continued. "But you showed me that authentic connection is worth every risk, that the most valuable things can't be calculated or controlled. They can only be experienced." Then, in a move that surprised her despite her suspicions about the evening's purpose, Thomas lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands. "Past experiences taught me to avoid commitment, to protect myself from emotional pain," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "But you've helped me recognize the immeasurable value of being vulnerable with you, of building something authentic together instead of hiding behind professional walls." From his pocket, he produced a ring, elegant yet distinctive, with a marquise diamond surrounded by smaller stones in an asymmetrical pattern that somehow worked perfectly together. "Grace Stone," he said, looking up at her with unguarded emotion. "Will you spend the rest of your life laughing at my spreadsheets, getting into the wrong cars, and making the impossible feel like routine?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment, before finding her voice. "Yes," she managed, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, to all of it." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Thomas referenced their shared journey by incorporating the story of how they met, that fateful car ride, into his proposal, making the moment even more meaningful by tying it to their unique beginning. 6 months after that rooftop proposal, the same space transformed once again, this time into a wedding venue that broke every rule of traditional celebrations. What does it look like when two people decide their wedding should honor not just their love, but the beautiful mistake that brought them together? The rooftop, where Thomas had proposed, became unrecognizable under the twinkling lights and floral arrangements carefully selected to complement the cityscape backdrop. But unlike most corporate events hosted there, symmetry was deliberately abandoned. The mismatched flower arrangements Thomas had specifically requested created a beautiful chaos that mirrored the unpredictable nature of their relationship. Each centerpiece told a different story, some tall and dramatic, others small and whimsical, a visual reminder that perfection wasn't the goal. The invitations arrived at guests' homes in sleek black envelopes that mimicked the luxury car where it all began. Opening them revealed the couple's playful approach, with words that captured their journey. "If you laugh, you're in the right spirit. If you trip, you're welcome to stay. And if you get into the wrong car, you've understood the theme." This wasn't just a clever nod to their beginning. It was a declaration that their marriage would embrace the unexpected, rather than fear it. As guests arrived, they discovered thoughtful elements that celebrated Thomas and Grace's unconventional story. The guest book sat beside a miniature black luxury car, with a bride figurine climbing inside. Signature cocktails were named The Wrong Uber and The CEO's Secret, complete with tiny umbrella garnishes reminiscent of Grace's broken one from that fateful rainy morning. When Thomas appeared at the altar, his transformation from the rigid CEO was complete. His light blue suit replaced the navy power suits of his corporate life, and only those closest to him knew the significance of the pocket square tucked into his jacket. The discreet embroidery featured a tiny penguin holding a hockey stick, a subtle tribute that connected their wedding day to their very first interaction. This small detail represented how deeply Thomas had changed. The man who once calculated every business risk now celebrated the beautiful accident that brought Grace into his life. The collective gasp when Grace appeared confirmed she had achieved the perfect balance between elegance and authenticity. Her flowing dress featured delicate pearl buttons down the back, but what everyone noticed first was her radiant smile that outshone every decoration. As she approached Thomas, his usually composed expression softened completely. "You look incredible," he whispered, his voice catching just slightly. Grace's eyes twinkled with mischief as she responded, "And you look nervous. Are you going to faint?" The exchange caused ripples of laughter among the guests who were close enough to hear, immediately setting the tone for a ceremony that would be as genuine as the couple themselves. The officiant, a college friend of Grace's, began with words that acknowledged the uniqueness of their bond. "We're gathered here today to celebrate a love story that began with what most would consider a mistake. But Thomas and Grace are proof that sometimes the wrong car is exactly the right destination." When the time came for their vows, Thomas surprised everyone by speaking without notes. The man known for meticulously prepared presentations now trusted himself to speak from the heart. "Grace," he began, his voice steady but vulnerable, "you crashed into my perfectly ordered world and showed me that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in quarterly reports." He promised to listen when you say you're right, which drew knowing smiles from those familiar with their dynamic. Grace's vows balanced humor with sincerity, as she promised to pretend to be surprised when you finally admit it. She spoke about how finding love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but finding someone whose imperfections complemented your own. "I promise to keep bringing chaos to your order," she said, "and to remember that the best moments in our life will be the ones we didn't plan for." The ceremony maintained this delicate balance between emotion and levity, creating a space where authenticity trumped tradition. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, a guest accidentally released confetti too early, sending a cascade of colorful paper floating down before the officiant had finished speaking. Instead of showing any sign of annoyance, Thomas and Grace broke apart laughing, with Thomas catching a piece of confetti and tucking it into his pocket as a souvenir. "Perfect timing," Grace announced to the crowd. "Exactly how we do things." The reception that followed celebrated every aspect of their journey. Instead of the traditional first dance song, they chose the same melody that had played during their pivotal moment at the company holiday gala. As they moved across the floor, guests noticed how natural they looked together. The once rigid CEO now moved with relaxed confidence, holding Grace as if they'd been dancing together for decades. "Do you remember what you first said to me?" Thomas asked as they swayed to the music. "Go, go, go!" "Not exactly the most romantic first words," Grace laughed. "They were perfect," he countered. "Direct, authentic, and impossible to ignore, just like you." The wedding cake further demonstrated their commitment to honoring their unique path. The three-tiered creation featured a smooth, traditional design on Thomas's side that gradually transformed into an artistic, almost chaotic pattern on Grace's side, with the middle representing their beautiful convergence. Even the wedding favors told their story. Each guest received a custom keychain featuring a tiny car with a message. "Sometimes the wrong turn leads exactly where you're meant to be." As evening turned to night and the city lights created a glittering backdrop, Thomas pulled Grace aside to a quiet corner of the rooftop. Away from the celebration, he presented her with one final wedding gift, a delicate charm bracelet with just two charms, a miniature car and a tiny rooftop. "For the beginning and for now," he explained, "with plenty of space for all the beautiful mistakes we'll make together." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she realized the magnitude of their journey. From a desperate job seeker, jumping into the wrong car, to becoming the partner of a man who had completely transformed through their connection. And so, a simple case of mistaken identity, a dead phone battery, and a car that wasn't an Uber, culminated in a love story for the ages. The beauty of Grace and Thomas's journey lies not in its perfection, but in its raw authenticity. Research confirms what their story demonstrates, that when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and genuine, we create space for the deepest connections to form. The walls Thomas had meticulously constructed throughout his career crumbled not through professional strategy, but through unplanned moments of genuine interaction. Their relationship flourished precisely because Grace never pretended to be anyone but herself, mismatched socks and all. In today's world, where we curate our images and polish our personas, Thomas and Grace remind us of the revolutionary power of authenticity. Their story proves that behind every title and position stands a human being capable of profound transformation when touched by someone brave enough to be real. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with carefully orchestrated meetings, but with honest mistakes that lead us exactly where we were meant to be all along.